Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. I'm hearing a little something. Oh, the washer upstairs is finishing a load. Welcome, Soundies. It's great to have you all here today. We are broadcasting live from a home studio, so we get home sounds from time to time. It's great to have you here. Hope you're all doing well. Mike, I have no idea. Where's Montucky? I'm curious about that now. All right, let's go ahead and head on over to our agenda and let's show you what we're going to do today. First up, we are going to focus on dialogue compression ear training. Again, just like we did last week where we looked at EQ and we gave ourselves an opportunity to kind of get some more experience in taking some dialogue audio, applying an EQ change to it of some sort, either a boost or a cut at a different frequency, various frequencies, and just letting ourselves hear that. We're going to do a similar type thing with compression today. Now, compression is, in some respects, a little bit more challenging. We started it a little bit last week, but I wanted to spend some more time on it, so that's why we're going to pick it up today. And then, of course, we do have a question that was submitted ahead of time, and then we'll go to the chat and see what people want to talk about there. So with that, let's start with compression, and let's go ahead and head on over to the Mac here. We're going to show you a couple of different clips I have here. One with Emma talking. She was recording just a little Sherlock Holmes quote, just like we used for Danny last week. In this case, Emma was talking to the Rode NT1. And then we have another recording here of me that we'll use as another sample in just a moment here. We are in DaVinci Resolve. I'm going to go ahead and give us a little bit more room here. And over here in DaVinci Resolve, you have for each individual track, so here, for example, Audio 1, which is represented in a channel strip right here, we have a dynamics processor and an EQ for every single one of these tracks. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the dynamics there. For this first track here, this is what we have set up. And right now we've turned it off, so it will not be applied at the moment. Let's go ahead and make sure that we have this track selected. And let's go ahead and play through it once as a start so you can hear where we're starting.
It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Okay, so that's where we're starting here. Now, why would you want to use compression for either a live situation or for post-production? There are actually a number of reasons. Number one is sometimes you just want to even things out so it's easier for people to hear what's being said. That's a valid use of compression. There is also such a thing as a leveler, and that's a slightly different approach to doing this kind of the same thing. We'll probably cover that in a separate video at some point or separate session. But a compressor will generally take the things that are kind of sticking out amplitude-wise, that are sticking up, and you don't see as much of it on Emma's. Let me just switch to this track here. Here, for example, we have a transient that's a little bit bigger right there, kind of sticking out above some of the others. You just want to kind of tame that a little bit and just make it easier for people to listen and follow without having to adjust their volume. That's one thing. Another thing is that once you apply compression, you can also then loudness optimize your audio. So if I take this video or this audio right here, right now, just as it is, and I'm going to come in here and say, hey, let's normalize this. Let's normalize it to maybe -16. Kind of from my point of view, a pretty reasonable loudness for, say, a podcast or some other sort of program that's mostly spoken word. We go ahead and click normalize and watch. We're getting awfully close there, and we may have actually had to engage that limiter, and that limiter may be something that you hear. Actually, yeah. So we'll give you an example of that audio-wise a little bit later. But that's just speaking of, why would you want to use compression? Those are some of the main reasons there. So there are also one other reason I guess I should touch on very quickly here is that you actually can sculpt the sound. Once you get a little bit more skilled with compression, you can use it to kind of tune how something sounds. And especially if you're trying to mix dialogue with some other things, like maybe there's some music sitting behind it in a movie, or it even doesn't have to be a movie, even a commercial piece. And what the compression does is it helps them to sit together better. So you can still hear the dialogue. It maybe has a little bit more weight to it, a little bit more, maybe it sounds a little warmer depending on how you compress it. So there are a lot of things you can do. You can also change how easy the audio is to understand with compression. Or honestly, you can mess it up. You can make it less easy to understand, and we'll take a look at that here as well. So, all right. Now, you could say, well, why can't I just use the normalize feature if I don't want to do any compression? Well, you certainly can, but there is going to come a point where you may not be able to, you may not have enough headroom. In other words, some of those transients may be sticking out. If you normalize it, it'll get crunched like we showed before. But here, for example, let's just take this one to minus 23. That's about what my voice is at right now based on the settings I'm using on my live compressor. But let's go ahead and normalize this. And let's go ahead and play it through. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to mute my own mic, and I'm going to just go ahead and tune the compressor a little bit. And what I want to do first is I want to use a really extreme example so you can hear what badly applied compression sounds like, and then we'll back it off a little bit. So what you're listening for here is how does the timbre of the audio change? How does the timbre of the voice change? So with that, let's go ahead and mute myself.
It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Okay, that is fatiguing to listen to, not only because it's the same thing over and over, but more importantly, because it was really, really heavily compressed. Now, there were a few things that we did there. So we switched back over here really quickly. Let me just run through the settings here. Now, most of you already know how to set up a compressor, but let me just very quickly, let's do a quick review of what these different things do, these different settings do. So threshold is the point at which the compressor starts to do its work, starts to reduce the overall volume or the amplitude of the audio that's playing. So you set this in dB, full scale in our case, for this digital compressor that's working with digital audio. And you'll notice that I set it really extreme. I think we had it down around minus 40. So any audio that was higher amplitude than minus 40 dB full scale would get reduced by the compressor. The ratio is essentially how much it would get reduced once it crossed that threshold, once it went above that threshold. And we used a ridiculous ratio of 15 to 1. 15 to 1 is actually not ridiculous if you're talking about a limiter, but it is if you're using a compressor. That's ridiculous. In other words, if I had a portion of the audio that went 15 decibels above the threshold, that 15 decibels will get reduced down to just 1 decibel above the threshold. So that's pretty extreme. And typically for dialogue audio, I'm typically going to run that between 2 and 3 to 1. So something a little bit saner like that. We also set the knee to a hard knee, so as soon as it hits that threshold, it kicks in. It starts kicking in. A soft knee, what it does instead is you can see how that curve kind of flattens out a little bit. It's smooth. It gets smoother. Here's a hard knee. Actually, if we use a more extreme ratio, you can see it easier. So here's a hard knee. So as soon as it passes that threshold, the compressor kicks in. With a soft knee, it sort of eases in instead. So it has a more transparent sound. It's not quite as obvious. So if you have a soft knee, that can be a helpful thing. Mix here just refers to how much of the compressed sound versus the original sound we're hearing. And if you leave it at 0 in this particular compressor, that's 100% of the compressed sound. You're not getting any of the original sound. But you can mix it if you choose to, if you want a little bit of each. That's going to be a little bit more common when you're doing compression as an effect as opposed to as an effort to optimize the loudness. So if you're doing some sort of piece where you're sound designing things and you're trying to create an effect, that's where you might mix. So you'll have some of the original plus the compressed audio. All right, attack. Attack is, in essence, how long it takes once the audio crosses the threshold to get up to the full compression ratio. So that's what this refers to. And we had it set to the fastest possible attack. And that does some interesting things to audio. We'll talk about that in just a little bit here, in dialogue in particular. Hold is just once it engages, this is how long it will hold. I think actually that will hold. Yeah, that's how long it will hold, at least that long. And then the release refers to how long it stops or how long it takes it to stop compressing to get back down to no compression after the audio drops back below the threshold. Okay, so we had this set pretty long here. And typically for dialogue, I would say I'm finding myself more and more these days, just as a kind of how I'm approaching things, usually somewhere around a 3 milliseconds attack and somewhere around 100 to 150 milliseconds release time generally. And what I'm aiming for usually with the spoken word audio that I'm working on is something that sounds very transparent. I want to control things, but I don't want it to sound really obvious that I've controlled them. I'm not generally trying to impose a lot of flavor or I want it to be very easy to listen to because mostly what I'm doing is educational video. So that's kind of my approach here. So let's go back and let's do this again. I'm going to start with these extreme settings again, and then I'm going to tune it to how I would normally probably set it for this audio here. So let's go ahead and run through that again. I need to mute myself first.
It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible.
Okay, we're going to take a break there. Let's see where we ended up here. So as that was playing, I did a few things, and we also didn't talk about makeup gain. Let me cover that in just a moment here. But what we ended up doing was we pulled that threshold all the way back up to -15. The audio was peaking somewhere between -15 and -10, generally. So we did that first of all. We backed off to a ratio of 3 to 1. I went ahead and applied a fully soft knee here. And then again, as per usual, I ended up with an attack around little over 3 milliseconds and a release 154 milliseconds. And so let me play that again and just let that settle in. I'm going to turn it off and play it without compression and then turn this on. And the question I want to see you respond to in the chat, if you have your hands free, you can respond in the chat, is can you hear it? Can you hear a difference there when I turn it on and turn it off? So Here we go again. Let's get muted.
Whatever remains. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Okay, go ahead and let us know in the chat down there if you're able to hear the difference there. Danny, were you able to hear the difference there?
Yes, I was able to hear the difference.
Okay, how did it sound different?
It sounded more even, for lack of a better word. But I have a question. Do you ever use the mix?
Okay, good question. Let's go back there, and you'll notice I was playing with things a little bit here. When I turned the compressor off, I had to pull this makeup gain back down. So I'm going to get to your question about the mix. The purpose of makeup gain is after this audio has run through the compressor, it gets quieter overall. So what I use is this makeup gain. So now that we've evened it out some, now I can push the levels up a little bit because those transients aren't sticking out so close to 0 dB that I have some space to do that. And what's also important is that when you are making audio judgments, evaluations, it's really important to play back at even levels, at the same level. So pre-compression and post-compression, like if you're trying to compare a compressed and a non-compressed clip of audio, it's important to try and listen to them at the same level because that'll help you evaluate the difference between them. And there's a psychological thing that happens with us. If something is louder, it generally sounds better. So that's why I was doing that. Now, your question about the mix. Again, only if I'm trying to do some sort of effect. Like this was if I had a bad guy voice and I wanted to maybe apply some really ridiculously strong compression and then mix that with their original voice as well, I might do that. That's a case where, from a sound design point of view, you might do that. Now, music, they do this a lot. So, for example, with drums, what you might do is you might do a mix. So you can hear the raw recording of the drums, but you might also, again, do some really pretty extreme compression and mix just a little bit of that extreme compression in, because it starts to do interesting things. For example, it starts to give, if you use like a really long release time on drums, for example, what happens is you start to get this sort of almost dancing effect. It gives kind of a pulsing or a rhythm effect to the already recorded drums. So that's a case where you might use it. So with that, let's go out to the chat and see what people are saying out in the chat so far. Were you able to hear the difference there? And if so, what did it sound like to you? I hear a difference, but it is quite subtle. Okay, good. The most noticeable was a change in volume. Yes. Crazy Sheep Films. Yes, indeed. That is the biggest difference. That's what I was aiming for. Rag and Bone Puppet Theater says it compressed sounds crisper. Interesting. Okay, good. We'll talk a little bit more about that. When would one use hold? You know what? I don't ever use hold. I grew up. When I learned compression, most of the compressors I used didn't have hold. I've noticed that in DaVinci Resolve, most of the processors have a hold. I think that's more likely going to be when you're doing sound design and you're intentionally trying to create a kind of a rhythmic sound. For example, if you're using a long release, you might want to spread that out a little bit to create an effect. So for dialogue audio, I typically wouldn't use it, is my short answer. Shoji, could hear a difference. With compression, her voice sounded more like a trained professional voiceover artist. Indeed. Interesting. Good. Okay. All right, let's talk about a few more of the things here, the settings here, and actually we'll move over to another sample here so you can hear what that sounds like. Oh, another one. Robert, I could not hear the difference because of the changing volume. Interesting. Okay. So let's go back there and let me just let me turn the makeup gain off and play it back again just to kind of illustrate the difference in volume between the two. and why we use makeup gain. First, I need to mute.
It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Okay. All right. There's some additional example there. So you could see when I pulled the makeup gain down and I turned the compressor off, it got quieter. Now that's the whole purpose of makeup gain, is to get to push those volumes back up. And again, as you listen back, it's important to listen back at roughly equal levels so you can evaluate how the sound is changing, as opposed to, whether just differences in volume or differences in loudness, I should say. There is something else I want to show you really quickly, and that is what happens if you change the attack. Let's experiment with that just a little. Oh, there's a question here first. Oh, very good. Hampton brings up a really good point that I think is 100% valid, and that is, I think the compressor brought up some breathing or other air movement sounds you might not want. And that's absolutely the case, especially if you have to end up doing heavy compression. The breaths will become more prominent because whenever you apply makeup gain, you're lifting everything. Now, the breaths, if you're doing your compression right, the breaths shouldn't be compressed, but when you apply that makeup gain, the breaths will get louder overall as well. Same with noise floor. Noise floor will come up. So that's where compression becomes like an art. You have to ideally not compress really, really hard, because then all of those things become super obvious. Now, when it comes to a really special piece, if you're working on something and you're willing to, and you have the time or the budget to invest, ideally, what I do is I do it actually manually, go in and actually adjust the breaths back down. There are some plugins like breath control in Isotope RX, but I don't find that those work super, super well. Sometimes they leave weird things that don't sound natural at all. So often what I'll do is go in and actually highlight the breath and actually attenuate it by 3 or 6 dB, or maybe even more than that, depending on the particular piece. But I don't like to remove breaths. This is just a philosophy or a personal preference thing. I feel like it sounds really robotic if you start removing breaths, because people breathe. There are some that say, well, no one wants to listen to your breaths. In real life, there are breaths. We're human beings and we breathe. So that's my perspective. Mark says, very subtle. Usually I hear a difference with compression when a voice is soft, then loud within the recording. Let's move to exactly that type of sample here. But before we do that, let me just run one more really quickly example on Emma's voice where we change the attack, and be ready to kind of evaluate. Tell me what you hear that's different as we change the attack on the compressor. Here we go.
It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. It is an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
All right. Did you hear that? I'm really curious to hear what you heard there. Danny, what was your impression?
I was paying attention to the comments, so I'm sorry I wasn't listening carefully, but it almost seemed like when the attack was higher, you got more mouth noise. But I don't know. I'd have to listen to it again.
Okay.
But you have a comment from prior to that test.
Yeah. Let's put that up.
Okay, so there's
Okay.
2 parts.
Ah, good. Renee says somehow it sounds weaker. I don't know, Renee, without the compressor. Okay, yes. So you do get a little bit more presence. That's one thing that compression can do too, is it makes it sit a little bit more forward, a little bit more, it feels a little bit more powerful. Absolutely. That's a good one. I found that RX breath control can wipe out the ends of T's and P's. Yes, exactly, among other things. But yeah, I found a similar type thing where it gets a little too aggressive sometimes, and then if you back off, then some of the breaths are making it entirely through, and so then you have some breaths that are attenuated and some that are just sitting, up and wildly visible, and it's or hearable, and it's not a great sound. Are you running through any compressor in ATEM control for the stream audio? And is the DaVinci audio running through that on the way to YouTube? Unrealistic topic. What's the monster over your shoulder?
Unrelated.
Oh, sorry, unrelated. No. So, well, we do have an emergency limiter on the master channel in the ATEM. Otherwise, we have no processing whatsoever in the ATEM. So yes, it is coming through the ATEM from the computer. But we're not doing any additional compression or anything like that. Just have that emergency limiter that's basically at minus 3 dB full scale. So if we're getting too hot there, just to keep from clipping the output is the only thing we're applying there. Now, this little monster here is Pincer the Crab, who is the mascot for our live stream. That's all. All right. Did anyone... to me, the attack makes the beginning of the speech sound sharper before it smooths out. Interesting. Yes, I think there actually is something to that, Mark. Thanks for that. Anyone else have notes on that? Okay, here is my experience. When you go with the fastest possible attack, what happens is that all of those transients get compressed. And when you do that, it makes the voice a little bit less crisp. It actually takes away some of the crispness, especially of consonants when we're speaking. And it sounds mellower. It sounds like you're almost like, not you're talking into a pillow, but the sharp sounds don't have the crispness to them, the impact that they typically have. So that's one thing that you have to watch for if you want to make sure that you maintain articulation and the ability to truly understand what people are saying. You might not want to get too aggressive on that attack. And I used to just crank it all the way down. My default used to be as fast an attack as possible and a 500 millisecond release. And that's a particular sound, and it's okay, but it's I find that it actually messes with the articulation of the spoken word a little bit, so it's not ideal. Now, this particular sample, by the way, does have a lot of mouth noise, so I would actually probably address some of that as well. So just that you're aware of that. So we heard all of that going through the compressor as well without cleaning that up first. So it's an important note. Okay, anything else in the chat before we move on?
There is, but do you want to address the other questions first? The Q&A?
Oh, no, we're not ready to go to Q&A just yet. It's almost half past. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's listen to this on another sample. This is going to be my voice, which I generally prefer not to do, but let's go. Okay, I just want to record something here really quickly. Now, sometimes you will intentionally have quite a bit of dynamic range. So here, for example, I can talk rather softly, and then I might actually want to emphasize something and talk a little louder, and then maybe a little bit more quietly again. But even aside from that, there can sometimes be this tendency for voiceover, especially if it's just sort of a podcast or someone who is not necessarily used to recording or who just has a more dynamic voice. They may actually especially start their sentences louder and then get softer and softer and softer. I think that's a pretty common thing we see. Now, obviously, levelers come into play at some point, but compression can also help handle some of those transients, those very quick portions of higher amplitude. So here's our recording for that. Okay, I just want to record something here really quickly. Now, sometimes you will intentionally have quite a bit of dynamic range. So here, for example, I can talk rather softly, and then I might actually want to emphasize something and talk a little louder, and then maybe a little bit more quietly again. But even aside from that, there can sometimes be this tendency for voiceover, especially if it's just sort of a podcast or someone who is not necessarily used to recording or who just has a more dynamic voice. They may actually especially start their sentences louder and then get softer and softer and softer. I think that's a pretty common thing we see. Now, obviously, levelers come into play at some point, but compression can also help handle some of those transients, those very quick portions of higher amplitude. So here's our recording for that. Okay. So that was an example where it was a much more dynamic recording from the start, and you could definitely, I definitely sensed it, I hope you did too, where it definitely smoothed it out, where otherwise if we had not used compression, there would have been more dynamic range. Now, sometimes you want dynamic range. If you're working on a film that's going to be screened in a proper theater with a proper, like a real playback system, a good playback system in an isolated space where people are there 100% to watch the film, more dynamic range can actually be really, really a powerful, basically, tool for the storytelling. However, if people are consuming the content in an airplane or in a car or in a train, what's probably most important in those circumstances is the ability to hear and understand what the people are saying. In those cases, that's where applying some compression is pretty important so that you can even things out and get the levels up to a very, very healthy level that's going to make it easier for them to hear. Especially like on planes, I don't know if you ever noticed this, sometimes you have to it feels like you have to crank the volume way louder because you have this constant sound of the airplane moving through the air plus the engines. This compressing and loudness normalizing will make it so that you don't have to push the volumes quite as loud for people to hear and understand. So with that, let's go to the chat and see what we've got going in the chat. You said there were some questions. Oh, no, before we do that, we have one question that was submitted ahead of time. So let's go to that first of all. And this is a question from John. Can you touch on de-essing techniques and ways to avoid excessive sibilance during recording? Yes. The first thing is to find a microphone that suits your voice. Now, some microphones have a tendency to emphasize the sibilant frequencies a little bit more than others. And I find that especially in less expensive microphones, to be honest. But the more expensive microphones are not immune from it either. So that's one thing. Another thing is that there is evidently voice training that I still haven't done any voice training, that evidently you can manage sibilance a little bit more based on the way that you talk and the way you move I think it has to do with the way you move your tongue. A lot of times the sibilance has to do with the shape of your mouth inside. So anyway, those are some things there, but finding a microphone I think is really helpful. And if you are looking, for example, I don't know if you're looking for like a voiceover mic, a large diaphragm condenser microphone, if you're looking more for production, like a video production type of microphone, a shotgun microphone or a pencil condenser. But there are lots of resources. We review a bunch of more production related microphones on our channel, Curtis Judd, and then Bandrew over at Podcastage reviews a whole bunch of, especially large diaphragm condenser and dynamic microphones over on his channel. So more the type of thing you would use for podcasting or for voiceover or even for music production is what you'll find mainly on his channel. So those are some good resources there. Now in post, now you are asking specifically about during recording. If you are using a channel strip, for example, there is the ubiquitous DBX286, which is a microphone preamplifier, plus a compressor, plus a de-esser, an enhancer, and an expander or gate. And so you could use that de-esser while you're recording so that you don't have to do as much work in post, or if you're doing this live, if you're actually doing some sort of live production. In terms of de-essers, that's a whole topic as well. But what you have to do first of all is find where the sibilant frequency is for that voice and microphone combination. And it's usually going to sit somewhere between 5 kilohertz up to about 10 kilohertz, somewhere in there, depending on the voice. And usually I find it closer down to 5 a lot of times. And so the way you can do that is you can actually take an equalizer and boost by, say, 9 decibels. I wouldn't go beyond that, but 9 decibels. Make sure your volume is at a reasonable level on your headphones or your near-field monitors or speakers. And then move that equalizer from 5 kilohertz up to 10 kilohertz until you find where the harshest sound of all is. And that's probably the frequency where the primary sibilance for that voice and microphone combination is. So that's how I would go about finding it. Now you can reduce sibilance a whole bunch of different ways. You can use an EQ. It's like a really hardcore, dirty way of doing it, where if once you find that frequency, you can just make a cut there, reduce it by 3 or 4 dB. There are dedicated de-essing plugins as well. A lot of them will allow you to choose the frequency as well. Some of them are intelligent and will find the frequency of the sibilance for you. One that I use a lot is the one in Nectar, Isotope's Nectar, which is a compressor and a de-esser all in one. So those are some things there. It might be a good topic, in fact, for a future episode. And in fact, let me make a note of that. I think that probably deserves its own dedicated session. So let's do de-essing. Okay, John, that's a really high level of de-essing, and we'll talk about it in more detail on another episode. Okay.
Is this the same person?
Oh, okay. You're asking for VO. Yeah, for voiceover, it's largely a matter of finding a microphone. And a lot of what I find is a lot of large diaphragm microphones on the less expensive end of the spectrum have this tendency to add this boost right in the middle of the sibilance frequency range. And what ends up happening is they're trying to make it sound airier, and unlike a dynamic microphone, where dynamic microphones, at least traditionally, tended to roll off. They tended not to be as sensitive up in those higher frequencies. And a lot of the less expensive condenser microphones in particular tended to boost a little bit in that presence or sibilance range. So I would be careful about that. That's kind of the main thing I'm thinking about. One of my favorite microphones for that, because I do have a fairly sibilant voice, and it's a little ironic. I was actually telling Danny and Emma about this week. We did a review of a microphone called the JZ Microphones V11. It's a large diaphragm condenser microphone. It's made by a company in Latvia, and they hand test each of them. It's not a cheap microphone. I think I don't know what the current price is. I think at the time we reviewed it, it was $700 or $800. But it was a really, really nice sounding microphone if you want a kind of a voiceover kind of sound to it, a broadcast kind of sound to it. Very rich low end, but it managed sibilance really, really nicely. So that's one of my favorite mics. And the reason I kind of giggle when I say that is we actually reviewed that earlier this year, and that video got extraordinarily far fewer views than we typically get on our videos, which is fine. Maybe people just weren't that interested. But and then in every video that I use it from that point on, people are like, wow, your voice sounds really good on that microphone. What microphone is that? So what we may have missed there is that I think our thumbnail wasn't really clear on what we were covering there, because the thumbnail just said vintage warmth on it, and it had a picture of, like, a silhouette picture of me talking into the microphone. So we're going to redo the thumbnail and see if that makes a difference. It makes it a little more findable. But the idea there is that's a microphone that manages sibilance really nicely. So finding the right microphone can make a huge difference. And that, to me, that microphone and my voice, it's like that microphone was made for my voice. I don't know if you have a lot of sibilance, it may be worth trying as well for yours. And John, if you want to take a look, if you go over to just type in Curtis, if you go to YouTube, Curtis Judd, JZ microphones V11, and that'll get you to that video if you're interested in that. Okay, let's go to the chat and see what we have going in the chat. Thanks so much. Thanks for the question. Love it.
Okay, we're going back to the
All right,
beginning.
we're going back to the beginning. If you have a question, just go ahead and tag it with @CurtisJuddAudio. Make it easy for Danny to find it. JHB asks, when using a Zoom F8n, what is recorded to the SD card, pre or post fader? Thank you so much for your continued sound expertise and help. What's recorded is, if you're recording the mix, that of course is post fader. And if you are recording isolated channels, then those are generally pre fader, although I think you can set it. Oh, there's so many recorders that I use. If you give me just a moment here, I will get a battery and hook it up, and we'll take a look at that. So with that, let's get the next question up on the screen while I'm getting this together so I can answer that question.
Okay, this has like 6 parts.
Hello, Judd boys and girls. I have a lot of questions. Okay. Hit us. The Zoom F6, the timecode cable adapter, can you show a link? Because I did test, normally I do not need a timecode, okay? For the cable to camera needs an adapter, but which? Change the channel. Okay, so we have not sure the best way to articulate that. Okay, so I think, Daniela, I don't know if you've already seen over on my video of my video review on the Curtis Judd channel of the Zoom F6, I linked to a very specific adapter. I don't know if that's the one you're looking for. If so, that should come up in Germany okay as well. It's an Amazon link, so it should show. You don't have to buy it from Amazon. I'm just saying that'll help you articulate which one it is. So that's the first thing, I think, if I'm understanding correctly. In recording and working with 32-bit, the headphone sound direct on Zoom F6 is perfect, but in DaVinci Resolve, it's poor. Is that because the levels are coming in lower than you had expected? Need a little bit more information there. Seems DaVinci Resolve there's a bug with 32-bit float. I haven't run into any issues with the most recent versions. If you're using one of the most recent, the 18 point, I'd say at least 18.1 and later. So I haven't run into any issues there, but you should be able to boost it and get where you need to be.
Oh, here's it.
Okay, so can you type the name of the adapter it needs for the timecode of Zoom F6 to the camera? Okay, so it's essentially a mono adapter. So it takes a stereo output and it takes the right channel and it makes that mono. So it's kind of a custom adapter. So that's the problem with the F6 is it has one port for timecode, both in and out. If you want to get it out, I believe, as I recall, it's the second channel, the right channel. So you have to get that right channel over into your camera. Okay, let's take a look here. I'm on the Zoom F8.
There's like 3 more.
Yeah, there may have still been problems with 32-bit float in 17, Daniela. So I'm not sure why 18 is not working. Maybe your computer can't run it. I'm not sure, but version 18 certainly does. Certainly works for that. Okay. I am looking at the F8. Excuse me. And I don't know that there is a way to record it pre-fader for the isolated channels, going back to the previous question. I'm not seeing a way to do that, so I don't know that that is an option if you're on the isolated channels. I don't know if that's what you're trying to do, but it's pre-fader on the isolated channels and post-fader on the mix. So I don't know. I don't see a way to change that here. This is on the F8n Pro. Maybe if I pop out to 24-bit mode, we'll be able to we'll be able to change that. So I'll take a look at that. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next question here. Appreciate the ear training sessions. Awesome. Thank you. So do I. I think we all get better every time we spend a little bit more time experimenting with this stuff. It's really useful. Shoji, are there times when you don't use compression on final dialogue voiceover projects? If so, for what reasons? I don't do a lot of this, but if you were mixing a film, there might be times when you don't need it. You want to maintain a little bit more dynamic range, and you have the luxury of being able to play it back, and you know that the audience is going, at least plausibly, that the audience is going to be listening somewhere where they can hear it better, like a theater, or even at home on TVs. That would be a case. Again, I don't generally do that, so I'm usually doing some sort of loudness optimization and some compression. Almost all the content I produce is consumed online, and probably largely on mobile phones, is my guess, based on the analytics I've seen over time.
Related.
Okay, related question. Have you ever used very low threshold levels and high ratios in an actual dialogue project? Only for effect. Only, again, if you're trying to intentionally make some sort of weird sound design effect, but not for normal spoken word audio. No, that would, it just sounds awful. We actually are in 24-bit I'm back at the Zoom F8n Pro again. And I do not see any way to change how the isolated channels are recorded. Going into the input menus and the record menus. And I don't see a way to do that. So I think the answer again is isolated channels are recorded pre-fader and mix is recorded post-fader. Okay. What's the difference between compressors and levelers? Good question. So a leveler actually will bring high amplitude things down and low amplitude things up. So it does a little bit of each. And the thing is you have to be, my experience is you have to be careful with a leveler as well for different reasons. A leveler can actually end up making a noise floor go all over the place. So it's, again, most levelers are bringing the high amplitude things down, the low amplitude things up. It can make that'll actually make the noise floor go all over. With a compressor, the noise floor is coming up as a whole. So it's not like one part has a lower noise floor than the other, whereas a leveler can. So you have to have my experience is you have to have pretty clean recording to use a leveler. And you have to be pretty modest on how you apply it. Otherwise, it becomes very obvious very quickly that you've applied a leveler. But that's the main difference between them. It's a good question. I agree. The DBX286, Mark notes here, has a great de-esser, and I completely agree. It's you get two things. You get to choose the frequency and the threshold. And so it's a two-knob de-esser, and it works pretty nicely. So the threshold is how much de-essing you want it to do, and the frequency is just at what frequency you want it to reduce the essing. Sheriff Logs, what are your thoughts on Hollywood films getting boring? It seems like they're more focused on remakes, hoping that people would go to the cinema and buy a ticket. Even Disney is margin as one platform with HBO Max. They are struggling to compete with Netflix. Okay, I'm gonna say some things here that I want you to not take don't want anyone to take personally. I do find there are a lot of boring mainstream movies out there. I'm not really into superhero movies. I feel like they're very, very formulaic. I've watched some, but they don't generally move me. They're pure entertainment. And if you want just a quiet night where you just need to unwind, fine. Well, actually, maybe not quiet night. If you want to just go home and have a movie that's not going to challenge you intellectually in any fashion, maybe a superhero movie is fine. They're adding little plot things, but those, I mean, the studios are trying to make money. They want as many eyeballs paying for streaming and for tickets as possible. Period. That's what they're looking for. That's the reality. Every once in a while, a really good film makes its way through. So there definitely are still some good films out there. There's more films being made today than ever. So I feel like there's a lot of even very expensive, mediocre films coming out. But there are also some really good films. You have to look a little harder for them, but I feel like there are some good ones out there. So that's my perspective.
Okay, so she wants you to show the link. The page of the thing.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. That's what I meant.
Okay, give me just a moment here. Don't switch to the computer yet, but I'm going to look it up and see if I can find it here. Okay, so I'm searching on YouTube for the Curtis Judd Zoom F6 review. And when I get to that video, I'm going to pause. Sorry, there's some sound there. I'm going to go into the description. Okay, now you can show it here.
Okay.
Daniela, this is the link I'm talking about here. So you go to the video, stereo to mono 3.5 millimeter adapter to send timecode to the Pocket 4K cinema camera. Here's the Amazon link. Amazon gets a little feisty if I show their pages on my stream, so I cannot do that. But if you click on that link, it should show it. But what you're looking for is a stereo to mono 3.5 millimeter adapter.
You read that off and I'll put it in the chat. Is that okay? I won't put the link.
Stereo to mono 3.5 millimeter adapter.
Whoa. Okay.
So that's what you'd be looking for at Thomann.
Cool.
Okay, good luck. Recommended signal path. Compress first, then normalize. Dialogue leveler, EQ last. EQ first. So I do a first pass of EQ to fix any issues, any resonances or harshness in the recorded audio. Then compress. Well, normalize. Let me talk about normalize. You can normalize up to a reasonable level just so that you can work with the audio beforehand. That's fine. But to loudness normalize, that's a last step, a very last step, in fact. Usually if I'm going to use a leveler, which I very rarely do, that'll be for a recording, again, that's pretty well recorded, not a lot of noise in it, and I just want to tune things a little bit. It doesn't need a lot. Then I'll apply the leveler. If I were going to apply maybe just a touch of additional compression, I might do that after that. And then if I wanted to do some EQ sweetening, I would do that, and then I would normalize. That would be the order in which I would do it. Normally, however, I would say that I generally will just do EQ, compression, and then normalize. I don't usually use levelers. And I don't usually do if I'm recording in a studio, I don't usually have to do a sweetening EQ pass, but that's why I usually only do those three. Sometimes I don't, if I'm using a really good microphone that fits if I'm doing them on my own audio, and I have a microphone that fits my voice, or audio of someone who was recorded in the studio that has a good microphone voice fit, then I don't have to do much EQ at all. So hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, this is almost the same.
Track processing order in DaVinci Resolve. Yeah, so same thing. So EQ to clean up any problems first, then compress. Well, take that back. EQ, if I have to do any denoising, I'll typically do that next. Then compression, and then normalize from there.
Well,
that's how we do it. Okay.
A whole bunch just popped in.
Can limiters replace compressors? In my opinion, no. They cannot replace compressors. The problem with limiters is if you limit hard enough, it will create distortions even though your audio is not hitting 0 dB. So you don't want to use a limiter. Should be like the last piece in the chain that's just catching any little thing that happens to make its way through. That's all a limiter should really be used for. For dialogue, in my experience. If you crank on a limiter and it's doing like consistent 5 dB of attenuation, at some point it's going to just sound really crunchy. It's not going to be a great sound. That's where with compression, you can be a little bit more gentle with it and finesse it a little bit more versus a limiter, which tends to be very aggressive and really kind of pounding the audio down into submission. So generally, no. They're related, of course, because they're doing a very similar thing, but generally a limiter is doing it in a much more aggressive way and should generally be reserved for the last piece in the signal chain. Oh, there's your pointer.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to type. They've changed the format.
Oh, the format of our little chat has changed, so it's harder to do
it
things
harder.
On the chat here. On live event, EQ first, then compressor, de-esser, enhancer, and gate last. Very good, Matt. Thanks for that. That seems, I would agree with that 100%. For the timecode adapter, you want to check that the stereo plug is only TRS, not TRRS. TRRS typically breaks out input mic and stereo headphone out. Yeah, that's why it's specifically that adapter for Daniela is a stereo, i.e. TRS, to mono adapter. Mark says, what's your take on phase correction before any other post-processing? I'm finding it so much easier to work with the audio file normalizing after phase adjustment. Yes, I forgot to mention that actually. Thank you, Mark. If I'm working with an asymmetric waveform, that is to say a waveform that has a larger amplitude consistently on the top versus the bottom, or the inverse of that, larger amplitude on the bottom than the top, I will typically do adaptive phase rotation first to even that up. And then I'll do the processing from there, the EQ. Now, you have to be careful with EQ because EQ can actually make the audio asymmetric. It can make those waveforms asymmetric if you're not using a linear phase equalizer. So if you're going to do some heavy EQ, I would do that first, then the adaptive phase rotation, then the compression, and so on and so forth. So order of operations, lots of fun. Okay. Do you use a limiter on your tracks? Limiter versus normalize. I do sometimes use a limiter, but again, I use it as the very last piece in a chain, and I would typically apply compression first because I want to be able to sculpt the sound to make it sound, I want it to be as transparent as possible. I don't want anyone to be listening to the audio and go, gosh, this sounds like you really compressed it. I want it to sound natural. And so that's why I'll use that compressor first and then a limiter after that to catch anything that the compressor doesn't. And it should just be little things that it's catching here and there at the most.
What do you do if it's too loud to do the clap?
Carnival Clone records from 11:11 was unusable. Hand clap did not work, was too much loud around us. I would have to think, I mean, yes, I can see how things could get really loud around you, but I'd have to think that even if the automatic sync using, the waveform didn't work, you should be able to to go into the audio clip and find where the clap is, there should be more of a transient there. Even if there's lots of other noise around it, put a marker on it right there. Then go to the video, and where there's a visual clap where the hands come together, put a marker on it, and then synchronize them based on the marker. That's usually how I approach that. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know which video. Oh, you're using Resolve. Yeah, you can do that in Resolve. And if worse comes to worse, if that doesn't work, literally go in the timeline and match up the two markers from the audio clip and the video clip, and then you'll be in sync. So hopefully that gets you where you need to be. Oh, Danny says it's time. Okay, it's time. Thanks, everybody, for coming to our session today. I hope you're doing well. Get out there and make some great sound, and we'll talk to you again next week.